This is just a quick tutorial on some basics of analyzing primary sources. In order to find the truth or to answer questions, we need to look at primary sources and secondary sources and make sure that what they're telling us, it matches, so it corroborates. So there's a bunch of questions that we need to ask in order to get to this point before we can actually understand the history of something. So for this short tutorial, we're going to just look at one image, and you'll be using the primary source analysis organizer. We'll go through this tutorial, and then you'll have the opportunity to practice these same skills. One method of analyzing or decoding an image is to first observe. So what can you identify and note some details. Then we can reflect. So this would be about you making inferences. So why do you think this is happening? What are some possible explanations? And then the last thing you might want to do is question. So what do you wonder about why this is happening, or how this is happening, or who this is happening to, that kind of thing. So let's start by just looking at some details. So one thing that you might notice, right, is some things like what is in his hand, right? And this would be a gun. You will also notice that the hair is very different. There's a lot of traditional style of clothing, right? You'll also notice things about his feet. So a moccasin style or shoeless kind of foot. You'll also notice in the background, right, that this is a fur hanging over or draped over something in the background. On the other side, you'll notice that this is the same boy, but you'll notice things like the European style of dress, right? The shoes, right? The pose is very different, standing in a more confident style of manner, right? He's got, a straight back posture. There's like a cap or a riding hat in the background. We also have a potted flower, which plants can symbolize certain things like growth and all sorts of things like that. What we might reflect on is, why do you think that somebody made this? What would be some purposes for making this image of a before and after, right? You'll notice that the faces have changed, right? The color of skin, darker to lighter. The hair has changed. A number of changes have taken place. So how does this fit into the story that we're trying to understand? What tool was used to create this? Why do you think that this is important? All of those kinds of questions. So the first thing on your organizer is to describe the source. So basically, what type of source is this? So it's an image, it's a photograph, which tells us that it is a primary source. So somebody during two different time periods of Thomas's life have taken these two images of a before and after style of picture. The next two steps on your organizer is context and provenance. So context is where and when was it made and created. So down here there's normally captions for photographs or background information. You'll see that it's the Department of Indian Affairs. It's Thomas More before entering into a Indian residential school in 1897 in Saskatchewan. And the other image, the second image, is again the same, Department of Indian Affairs, and this is after, so him graduating from an Indian residential school in Saskatchewan. Provenance is about who created the source, why was it created, and who do you think the intended audience is. So being taken by the Department of Indian Affairs, some things that we've already learned about Indian residential schools is the fact that the government was taking these young children and placing them into these schools, trying to, quote, civilize, unquote, them. So you can kind of get a sense of this before and after. What would be the purpose? Is it to educate the public, the rest of Canadians, on how great these schools? Is it to educate other Aboriginals on, the benefits, I guess, of sending your children to these schools? But overall, the idea is that it's a piece of propaganda, right, used to convince people that residential schools were improving, civilizing Aboriginal people. Interpretation is the next stage. So basically, in your own words, what is the source saying? How does it help us answer our question? Residential schools progress or decline? Were the 20s good times for everybody? Although this takes place, this photo is before the turn of the century, residential schools were operating for, over 100 years. So when we look at this, right, it shows us that the government progress meant eliminating language and culture of Aboriginals. It meant assimilating them into everyday European Canadian culture. For Aboriginals, you can see that there's a clear decline because their culture and their way of life was taken away from them. Languages disappeared, children disappeared during this time period. So perspective is another issue that we need to look at. But overall, we can see that when we're looking at progress and decline, that we're going to have to now look at this idea of residential schools from multiple perspectives. And for the most part, most of the evidence will be very clear. Corroboration is the last step on your organizer. And this is you asking the questions, how is this source the same and or different from other sources? Although this is our first primary source that we're examining, we'll see that it's pretty close or similar to the background video showing and talking about the elimination of culture and the isolation of family. You'll also look at the faces, right, from darker to lighter, probably telling us that they're spending more time in a school, in a building, than they are outside in their traditional style of life. And if you look at the faces, it took a long time to take pictures, but their face is pretty emotionless or sad, right? So one other thing that we'll do is, one thing that we will do, and we'll continue to do, is to see whether or not this source corroborates other sources. You'll be given the opportunity to practice this skill, but one way to do it is also to check the internet. There's an easy, CBC. Sometimes they a good source, but like everything needs to be corroborated. That way that the information that you're using is actually credible. So when we look at things like what is a residential school, things like assimilation, did we see evidence that there was assimilation in this image, from something more traditional to something European and Canadian? The fact that the government felt children were easier to mold than adults. This is a child and not an adult, so we can see that the government did target children. And then prepare them for mainstream society. By mainstream society, in this image, it meant a Canadian-European mainstream society. So now I want you to try this on the assignment page, looking at different pieces of evidence and using the Analyzing Primary Source Evidence Organizer. Good luck!